Hi, I'm Michael Kimmelman, architecture critic for the New York Times, and you're listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. Nowhere in the world celebrates modernism better than Modernism Week in Palm Springs, California, every February. This 11-day architecture and design festival hosts exciting modernist house tours, insightful lectures, designer shopping, architecture documentary premieres, eye-popping house parties, detailed exhibitions, and much more. And for almost 10 years, U.S. Modernist Radio has been your gateway to all the action, reporting from the U.S. Modernist Compound, aka poolside at the hip Hotel Skylark, interviewing guests in the world of architecture and design. I'm Tom Guild. Over this spring and summer, we'll bring you over 25 interviews, plus special guests recorded right here in the studio. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by June Goldfinger and Jeff Taylor, sponsors of Circle, Square, Triangle, a traveling exhibition on the architecture of Myron Goldfinger, and by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs. Way back in 1987, New York Institite of Technology architects Michael Schwarting and Francis Campani saved the 1931 Aluminaire House from destruction. Then they rebuilt it. Then they had to take it apart. Now, nearly 40 years later, Aluminaire House has reached what is likely its final resting place at the Palm Springs Art Museum, visible today on the museum grounds. Today, you will hear about this visionary house designed by Palm Springs architect Albert Frey before he came to Palm Springs, and Aluminaire's journey from a private Long Island estate to the New York Institute of Technology, multiple dismantlings and reassemblies, and finally, to its new home in Palm Springs. Later on, we'll chat with noted architectural photographer Robin Hill. And now, someone who can survive 2 weeks on martinis and past appetizers and still lose weight, your host, Mr. Modernism, George Smart.
It's really a very simple diet. You just start off in the morning with a little bacon frittatas and coffee, skip lunch, and then wait till cocktail hour, when small amounts of food are going to be passed around to you on trays in Palm Springs in the afternoons, along with the martinis and the drinks. It sounds very decadent, but I always lose like 3 to 7 pounds every time that I go out. It's a fantastic way to stay in shape. Maybe I'll do an exercise and diet book based on all of this. When playing that Frank Sinatra vinyl of your mom's that has you want to dress up and find her martini recipe, you know it's time to think about going with us to Palm Springs for Modernism Week, the epicenter of the modernist architecture we all love. We're going again in February of 2025, and you can stay with our crew at the U.S. Modernist Compound, a.k.a. the swanky Hotel Skylark. Just email me at george@usmodernist.org.
Francis Campani and Michael Schwarting are architects and professors whose primary area of interest is residential design, particularly multifamily housing. Both spouses and partners, the couple is loved for using the classroom as a laboratory to test real-world designs. In private practice, they have worked steadily to green their hometown of Port Jefferson, New York, through transit-oriented development. They are together best known as the architects who saved Albert Frey's 1931 Aluminaire House, the subject of a recent Modernism Week talk. Here's George talking poolside with Francis and Michael.
Francis, I want to start with you.
Okay.
Are you by any chance a hockey fan?
No.
Because I understand you played way back, didn't you?
No. Oh, well, I played a little field hockey.
Field hockey,
when
that's
I
what
was,
it was.
When I was in junior high and early high school.
Kings Park, New York.
Wow. Quite amazing. I was not very good.
No?
I was fast, but hitting the ball was not always in the cards.
I was on the JV soccer team. I was terrible. So much so, I managed to get myself kicked off the team to run the concession stand,
Yeah.
which was much more
Right.
my passion along those lines.
Uh-huh.
And Michael, I understand that at some point you worked for Richard Meyer,
I did, yes.
and I was wondering if you recall, what are some of the houses that you worked on while you were there? Because he still continued to do them over his whole career.
Yes. Well, I was pretty early in Richard's career. He was beginning to get large projects. So the first thing I worked on was the Bronx State School, which is a big project, mental health for children. Mm-hmm. It was, I think, a little bit of a slow period for houses, but I worked on one in Chappaqua. I can't remember the owner's name. And I was an associate with Todd Williams, and Todd Williams was working on the house in Michigan.
The Douglas House.
The Douglas House.
Right. We just interviewed the new owners of that.
Uh-huh.
Fantastic house.
Yes. Well, Todd's going to be here in a couple of days to talk.
Okay.
He's going to talk about the Obama Library.
Of course, yeah, sure, sure. You all have been working with the Aluminaire House in some capacity or the other for 37 years now.
Precisely.
Right.
So that's a commitment. This is not a fad between the two of you. So what was your first encounter with it?
I'll let Michael start.
Yeah, actually, it relates a little bit to Richard Meyer. He was beginning to work with metal panels on some of the bigger projects, and I was asked to do some research into manufacturers of metal panels and uses of them, and I came across a little article on the Aluminaire House that was from the late 30s. Not much was advertised about it or written about it at that time, and I later on, teaching at Columbia University, took students to visit it. Then Paul Goldberger wrote in the New York Times that the demolition was imminent, and it was too bad because this was happening quite a bit on Long Island and with modern buildings. At the same time that I took a position at New York Institute of Technology to teach, the dean at the time told us about contacts that he had to if the school was interested in the building, and I said, for sure. That was a great start to a teaching career at New York Institute of Technology.
Yeah, Michael was appointed chair of this relatively new campus in Central Islip on Long Island, and as chair, he hired adjuncts, and he hired me.
Ah.
And I had sort of two jobs, teaching and working with the students on the drawings for this new project of the Aluminaire. And the first part was to take the house apart on its location in Huntington. So we drew it carefully, took some pieces off, drew it again, kept removing parts, and then brought them over to Islip to begin the reconstruction.
How long did the reconstruction take that time?
It was slow. Not exactly on purpose, but by default in a sense, because one of the criteria for getting the house with the university was that we would be able to get some money to do the project. So we applied to New York State Department of Preservation. It's mixed with Parks and Recreation for some reason. And we got a $130,000 grant. The owner of the house said, you can take it if you get it out of here as fast as possible, which we didn't do quite as fast as he wanted. The money, the grant that we applied for, we wrote into it that we wanted to do it with students. So twice a week, 2 classes a week for 3 hours, we all put on construction clothes and went and took it apart in 2 years' time. And then we began cleaning the parts and putting it back together. But 2 days a week times 3 hours is very minimal.
Yeah.
So for more than 10 years, we operated in that fashion.
But the slowness actually let more students be involved.
Right.
So 9 semesters, I think you worked, or more.
So what year was it completed on the campus?
It was never completed. We didn't finish the inside. So this is exciting for us now. We're seeing things that we hadn't seen since we took it down. But by early 90s, mid-90s, I guess.
Yeah, 93, I'm sorry, for the celebration, the frame was up.
Okay.
And
Right.
then we finished it, so By the 96 or 7, we had it put together with the windows in and glazing.
And people could walk up to it and look at it, but you
Yeah.
couldn't go in at that time, right?
Oh, we could go in.
We went in.
Okay, all right. That's good.
Yeah. It wasn't finished inside, but it was all accessible. So,
All right.
but it was essentially a site under construction.
How did you persuade the local city mothers and fathers that this was a sculpture or an exhibition as opposed to a residence that you have to put all the building code requirements on?
Well, one is the site, which we had to have approved by New York State, part of the grant. But the site was right next to the School of Architecture.
Okay.
So it wasn't in a residential area at all. So that made it pretty impossible to be able to live in. Although we also always talked about wanting to live in it.
I bet you did.
But the building permit was complicated, and Francis did all the drawings to get the permit. The biggest issue was how we would accommodate the ADA requirements.
There was a lot of negotiation. I mean, we said that some of the issues didn't meet code because it was a historic house, but the building department said, what historic house? There's no house. There's an empty site. But we said, but it is in fact a historic house which is being reconstructed. So our strategy was 2 parts: to reconstruct it as a historic house and then to open it to visitors, which we never were quite able to do other than it being a construction site. So historic house and then a historic house to be open to visitors. That was our 2-part strategy.
At what point did you realize you were going to have to take it down again?
2004, at which point 2004, the New York Institite of Technology decided to take its academic programs off that campus. And then ultimately pieces of the campus were for sale. And we knew at that point that we had to have a strategy for taking it down. We didn't actually deconstruct it until 2012.
Okay. And did it go into a truck somewhere?
We leased a
trailer.
A trailer for a tractor trailer. So it was a container, but it could be moved. And we pulled it up right to the house. We had contractors we had worked in our practice with, 4 or 5 guys that took it all down in less than a week, put it in the trailer, and it went into storage on Long Island. The storage company wouldn't tell us where it was. It was a secret. So for a number of years, we weren't sure where the house was.
Really? Why wouldn't they tell you?
Well, they have a couple of storage yards, and we were concerned about insurance, and they said, don't worry, it's perfectly safe. No one knows where it is.
I mean, I wouldn't think it would be something that would be stolen because of all the work required to put it back together.
Well, there's an interesting story about that. When they built the World Trade Center, the first World Trade Center, they took down some cast iron buildings in lower Manhattan. And there was a building, I believe it was called the Bogardus building, but it was by the architect Bogardus. And it was called the Lang building, a beautiful cast iron building that they were going to rebuild. They put it into storage. When they decided they wanted to rebuild it, it was stolen. It was gone. So in the back of our minds, we always said, this could be another one of those cases.
It could be.
Well,
that would be a great true crime show for
right.
TV,
Well,
right?
I was always worried that if it was, we paid for storage every month. If for some reason the storage wasn't paid or something went wrong, that people would just think it's a bunch of scrap aluminum and say,
And sell it.
yeah.
Aluminaire is now in Palm Springs, of course, but were there other suitors for the house? Did you get inquiries from other places?
We did have a few, because when the campus closed, the university lost interest in it altogether. They weren't interested in moving it to another part of their other campuses not so far away. So we looked for places, people that might be interested. We talked to Barry Bergdahl that we just saw this morning about putting it on the roof of MoMA, but that didn't fly.
Right.
Occasionally we'd have inquiries from people who just said, I have a piece of property in Connecticut or out east, and can we put it there? We made a pitch to put it in Sunnyside Gardens. There's a corner lot which was a kind of abandoned playground, and Sunnyside Gardens is Henry Wright and Clarence Stein from the same period, late 20s, early 30s, low-cost housing, We thought it was perfect for Aluminaire, and the site itself was part of the Landmark District. And the New York City Landmarks Commission was quite interested. Their staff thought it was a great idea. But the local neighbors in Sunnyside Gardens did not like the idea of this modernist Aluminaire house.
This modernist 1931
right
house.
Right next to their 1931 Sunnyside Gardens.
Brick.
Which were brick. And Phipps House is right across the way. Beautiful. I mean, it's a beautiful area and well documented, but they made a lot of noise protesting it and went to their local politicians, and that was the sort of kiss of death
for that.
on that approval.
What year was that approximately?
That was...
Up till 2014.
Yeah,
2012
right.
to 14.
The hearing was the very late part of 2013.
Okay.
It was pretty depressing.
Not bad.
We had spent 2 years getting through the building department to do it, and then we got turned down.
And we negotiated with the owner of that lot, because it was zoned for 8 units of housing, and we actually designed housing for him gratis, and said if we can have the very corner for the Aluminaire, and he sort of reluctantly said give it a try, but the try didn't work. Yeah.
When did Palm Springs approach you about bringing it here?
Right when we were waiting to hear from the Landmark Commission.
It was Mark Davis.
Mark Davis invited us to give a talk at Modernism Week 2014. So we came out, the Annenberg, it was full of people. We had a wonderful time presenting it. But between when we were asked to do the lecture and when we did the lecture, we learned that Landmarks didn't approve the project. So we ended our talk saying, we're looking for a site. And someone said, why don't you bring it here? And the place went wild.
Well, Mark had already asked us to bring it here. And we said, well, thanks very much, but we have this site in Sunnyside, Queens.
Yeah.
And we thought that was all going forward.
But there was such a positive response to that. And Mark was determined that this should happen. So we started right away to work with Mark. And he organized a committee called the California Committee. Because in 2010, was it 10 or 11, I think. We formed the Aluminaire House Foundation. Since New York Tech didn't want it anymore, we had to figure out right away what to do. So we got it for $10, and we asked a colleague of ours, Kenneth Frampton.
Sure, I've talked to Kenneth,
historian. We had to have 3 people on our not-for-profit committee, so he became the vice president of our organization. By the time we went out to here to lecture with Mark, he formed Aluminaire House Foundation California Committee with Beth Edwards and Brad Dunning was on it in the beginning.
Right.
William and then later Tracy Conrad as well.
Yeah.
And when did it make the journey out here in a truck all the way across the country?
2017.
And then it sat waiting and waiting and waiting.
After waiting for a while on Long Island, then it waited for a while in Palm Springs.
And it got heated up, I think.
Yeah.
Every summer.
But it was in a city-owned storage yard, I believe. We, for a while, thought it would go on a city-owned property across from the museum. When they were developing the park, we had various sites we had looked at there, always close to the museum. But we think the site is better than the earlier site.
It's a beautiful site.
Yeah.
I understand that only the exterior is going to be viewable. You won't be able to go into this one, right?
Right.
Now, why is that?
Well, almost the same problems we had back on Long Island. The ADA requirement, and apparently museums are really being watched carefully for that issue. We proposed to make the same argument we made on Long Island. The garage is the biggest room in the house.
Yes.
And it could be used as an exhibition room. And
it's completely accessible.
Right.
Right. And Adam Lerner has been interested in making a kind of fly-through, some sort of video presentation. So that could be an argument. But at the moment, just getting to this point is what the museum has been concentrating on.
Sure. And it's expensive to put this kind of thing together. What are the costs involved in reassembly? Because they raised a lot of money to do it.
Yes. Well, a lot of money, I think, has gone into the site. It's a truncated parking lot. It was in the middle of their southern parking lot. So quite a bit of money's gone into site preparation, landscaping, and so forth. So we don't actually know the real breakdown of it, but they've raised over $2 million to be sure that they could get to this point.
When people visit the site and walk around and take photos, how do they learn about the history of the house? Are there explanatory panels around it?
There's a lot of information that's going up right at the front gate. It'll be in fact, the fencing is going up right now.
Okay.
And at the gate entrance, they've produced a lot of graphics to explain the history of it. We've seen part of it. It's going to tell a bit of the story and hopefully instigate imagination to be able to put it together.
And they can buy our book, which will
Tell
be
me
out.
about that book.
Which will be out next fall.
Okay.
Gibbs Smith publishing it, and we wrote most of it 20 years ago, and it has the history of the house and the history of its deconstruction, reconstruction, deconstruction.
Do you have a name for the book?
The Aluminaire House.
The Aluminaire House. Good name. Good name.
That's all it needs.
Let's go back in time now. So when the house debuted, what was the reaction to it? How many people saw it? What did the world think of Aluminaire in 1931?
They say that 100,000 people went through the house. It was an exhibition house constructed within the Grand Central Palace, which is near Grand Central Station, doesn't exist anymore. It was a big exhibition hall, and it was put up in 10 days. It was exhibited for a week. It was reported in the New York Times, the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, all the newspapers, and then it was reviewed in other places too. The New Republic, which was published once a week, as it is now, and it got a lot of attention. I would say both positive and negative. Some of the little reviews said, "Oh, it's terrible, and not enough storage. The closets have glass doors. Who would want to live like this?
Who would want to live like this? I know." And this was when aluminum was kind of a new thing too.
Yes.
We take it for granted now.
Right.
But then, Alcoa was going great guns, and you were having new aluminum products, and this was 30 years before plastics came along, right, with the Graduate, and that was the new thing in the 60s.
Right.
But the response to this, from what I read about it, was it was phenomenal, and people just thought about it as this is our future.
Right.
Yes.
By 1970, we're all going to be living in these Aluminaires, right?
Yes.
Right. The other interesting issue, which we write about a lot and talk about, is that at the same time as the exhibition in April 1931, Kocher and Frey wrote an article, which was published in Architectural Record, Real Estate, Subdivisions, and Low-Cost Housing. And basically, they used the Aluminaire-type unit to propose communities. So it wasn't just a freestanding house. It was a house that made a system, often attached, of different ways to organize a block. And they used a block rather like Sunnyside, Queens,
Sure.
And this was very important for us from the very beginning, that when Wallace Harrison bought the house and put it up on Long Island, it was thought of as a weekend house. In fact, when Philip Johnson and Henry Russell Hitchcock put it in the international style book, it looked like a weekend house. In fact, it was called the Harrison House. It wasn't called the Aluminaire House. So we've sort of campaigned, I think, for the whole time we've been with this house to restore that knowledge. That they were asked to demonstrate modern materials, but they had another agenda, which was to look at the possibility of low-cost housing.
Were there any ideas or technologies inside the house that got adapted elsewhere, like a certain way of construction or a certain element that kind of took off in other places
That's
that
an
you know of?
interesting question. I mean, the construction is rather like a skyscraper. I mean, it's a one-way cantilever of sort of space girder, and the walls are true curtain walls hung off the edges of the floors and with angles. And so in residential construction, probably not so much. But there was a dumbwaiter. That's an interesting element.
But that has sort of caught on, probably with a lot of the California mid-century modernism, that rather than build conventionally the kind of common dwelling type, Albert, who had worked with Le Corbusier, was interested in the free plan and the free facade. So it was much more the technology of building skyscrapers than it was a house. And that probably brought the idea of building with metal and not with wood and some of those ideas.
You can see this house at the Palm Springs Art Museum. It's free to view. It's right out in front to the left of the building, right near the infamous Marilyn Monroe statue. Thank you both for coming to talk with me. It's really a pleasure to meet you finally.
Pleasure.
It's great to be here.
That was George talking with Michael Schwarting and Francis Campani.
I met art and architecture photographer Robin Hill in a most likely place, Philip Johnson's Glass House in New Canaan, Connecticut. Every June, they have a big summer party on the 50-acre spread. Most people don't realize there are multiple buildings around the property, not just the Glass House. The main Glass House is, of course, the most famous, but right across from it, there's something called the Brick House, which has been under renovation for years and opens up this summer 2024. Robin Hill began his career in 1987, taking pictures of toddlers in supermarkets across London. He didn't know that one day his photographs would be exhibited at the Guggenheim Museum or at the world's leading design publications, such as Vanity Fair, Wallpaper, and Architectural Digest. He's worked with Herzog and de Meuron, Zaha Hadid, and Architectonica, and has collaborated on more than 20 books. Welcome, Robin.
Thank you very much for having me.
Robin, our ACE research team discovered that your favorite memory is sitting around a campfire with the Boy Scouts singing Whiskey in the Jar by the Dubliners. Can you sing a few bars for us, Robin?
As I was going over Kilgarry Mountain, I met with Captain Farrell and his money he was counting.
That's for real.
First I drew my pistol, and then I drew my rapier, saying, "Stand and deliver, for I am a bold deceiver. Marshering damadoo damada, work for my daddy-o, work for my daddy-o, there's whiskey in the jar."
All right.
I did not know that we had a musical
Alrighty.
guest on today. Wow.
We're off to a great start.
Yeah, we are.
Musical guest, Robin Hill. Thank you, Robin.
Well, no wonder that's a wonderful memory.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that was a very early memory. I learned that song when I was like 9 years old. And we were Cub Scouts, you know. We used to go camping, and the guy that was running the scout troop, he was a folk singer, and he taught us all these old Irish folk songs, you know.
Well, that's pretty cool. And your rendition of it is lovely.
Yeah, he taught you well.
So how does a geography major from Nottingham, England, wind up in architectural photography?
When I was 20, I was at the University of Sheffield. I was studying geography. I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but my great auntie Kathleen bought me this nice camera, and I remember it was a Minolta X300, and it had this nice little 50-millimeter lens. And she bought me this camera, and overnight I fell in love with photography. And I spent the last couple of years at college basically not really studying too much, just trying to become some sort of a photographer. And originally I was sort of attracted to the little graveyards and sunsets and all these cliches. But I had this very passionate enthusiasm. So I graduated in 1986. And the first thing I realized is that in order for me to become a professional photographer, I really had to move to London. So I hitchhiked down to London. And the guy that actually picked me up, his name was Dodd Miller, and he happened to be a photojournalist, a really, really good one.
Oh, wow.
And in the 3-hour trip down from Sheffield to London, Dodd taught me pretty much, not everything I needed to know as a photographer, but a few really important things. And the most important one was, Robin, I don't care about your equipment, just spend your time training your eye. Train your eye. So I took that on board, and he also said one other thing that was very important, which was that the camera is your passport into any sort of sector of society. So he was shooting at the time for The Observer and The Guardian and the Sunday Times, all the big newspapers in England. And one day he'd be shooting bricklayers in London, but the next day he'd be shooting a businessman, the next day an artist, and the next day a captain of industry. And wherever he went, it was his camera that allowed him into all these different places. And I said, that sounds fantastic. That's what I want to do. So that was what got me going, is that, you know, my camera was my passport into any world that was going to be open for me. So that was kind of the genesis of how I got started.
You could have chosen any path, though, so how did architecture enter into the equation?
Well, architecture came along quite a lot later. So originally, I was taking pictures of babies and toddlers in supermarkets and department stores across London. This is in the 1980s. And eventually, I got pretty tired of that. And it was a Monday morning, and the Guardian newspaper used to have this advertisement for creative marketing and media. And down in the bottom right-hand corner was this little advertisement saying, "Cruise ship photographers wanted." So I called this guy up. His name was Mike Brinkhurst. I'll never forget it. And he was staying at this really nice hotel in London. I'm like, I wonder what that's about. So I go along with my portfolio, and he says, "I like your work, Robin. You're the kind of person we're looking for. And in 2 weeks' time, if you want to start, you'll be starting work as a cruise ship photographer." So I flew over to Miami, and I started my new life over in the United States at the age of 22. So, you photograph cruise ship passengers and as they come on board, and then you dress up as a pirate and you go around the dining room and somebody else takes the pictures and you say, "Shiver me timbers." And you take all these cheesy pictures with the passengers, But for a kid that was a working kid coming out of England, suddenly I was actually earning some money and, I was actually able to buy some equipment and gradually build up my career, as a photographer. But there was a kind of a downside to the cruise ship photography because you get very, very burnt out. But I will say this, it did help me to travel the world. I met some amazing people, and I was able to sort of hone my craft and lean on the other photographers as well, who taught me a lot of what they knew.
It was Miami Modern that introduced you to a lot of architectural photography. Was that a lightning bolt moment for your career, or did it creep up on you?
No, that was an epiphany for sure, because once I left the ships, I became a travel photographer, and I started shooting for magazines like Islands, National Geographic Traveler, a lot of the in-flight magazines for American Airlines and Delta, that kind of thing. And although I was finding that enjoyable, I was feeling that there was a lack of purpose in it. And then in 1999, a friend of mine was going out with this lady. Her name is Terry D'Amico, and she is one of the people that coined the term MIMO, which is short for Miami Modern. And over in Los Angeles, of course, it's kind of called Gucci or Googie architecture.
Right.
Over here in Miami, it's called MIMO, and it basically refers to the architecture between 1945 and 1970 that was happening here in Miami at that time. And she gave me a tour of all these buildings, and I wasn't really familiar with any kind of modern architecture. And I was kind of like fairly naive about it. Now, sometimes when you're naive about a subject, it's actually quite helpful because you get to see it with totally fresh eyes. And she showed me around, and she said, "Robin, this is the Fontainebleau. This is Morris Lapidus, 1954. It's an icon of modernism." I thought, "That's an interesting looking building. Maybe I'll come back later when the sun's hitting it in a different direction," I said to her. And she says, "Well, next door is the Eden Rock, and Morris Lapidus, he also designed that, and that was in 1955. She gave me a tour of the rest of Miami, and for some reason, all of these names and dates, they totally stuck with me. And so I knew that something had kind of shifted inside of me, but also I was very attracted to the optimism that was displayed in the architecture. And it was very sort of, the word that I'm looking for is, it was a creative interplay on the international style. So, you could take a building like the Bacardi building here in Miami, which is by Enrique Gutierrez, a well-known Puerto Rican architect, in 1964. And he put up this beautiful 10-story international style. It's not really a skyscraper, but it's a very thin, eloquent piece of modernism. But on the side of that building is this incredible mural by Francisco Brennan, who is a noted Brazilian muralist. And it's this beautiful ceramic tile in blue and white that comes all the way down one side of the building. And when you have those two things together, one that's really playful and the other one that is more like Mies van der Rohe, right? Much more strict and disciplined architecture. Right. It creates this real, I wouldn't say it's a conflict, I'd say it's a confluence of styles. And those confluence of styles here in Miami being built between those years, 1945 and 1970, really showed where we could go as a civilization, at the peak of our ability. And so it was very much looking towards a brighter future. Whether that turned out that way or not, of course, is a completely different question. But at the time, you'd see all these space-age things attached to buildings. So I remember when the first delta-winged fighter came out in, I think it was 1947, something like that, suddenly a lot of the buildings had delta wings on them as well. And all these little things like orbits and spirals, all of these things were borrowed from the space age. And a lot of the architects down here in Miami, they put it into their buildings. And it was like, okay, this is the space age in architecture. So I was very attracted to that. And it's sort of quirky, it's sort of peculiar, it's very Miami, and it's distinctive from the Los Angeles sort of goody. They're more like cousins as opposed to brothers, I would say. So that's what got me interested in architecture, and really that was in 1999, and I've been doing architecture ever since.
And your work from that project was exhibited in New York, and then there was a book. So this was on fire.
Yeah, the exhibitions started down here in Miami. The whole thing got put back about a year or so because of 9/11. It was right at that time. So we had an exhibition down here, and I remember Beth Dunlop, who was the architecture critic for the Miami Herald at the time, came along to the show, and she really gave it a glowing sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Review. That's the word I'm looking for. I knew it was a difficult one. A glowing review. And it was me, and there was a couple of other photographers that were involved as well. Then the show went up to the Municipal Art Society in New York, which, as you probably know, is the society that Jackie Kennedy was very active in and that helped save Grand Central. And at that time, they had these beautiful galleries at York House on Madison Avenue. The show was well received, and then it became a book that was written by Randall Robinson and my friend Eric Nash, and that was published by Chronicle in 2004. And that is called MIMO, Miami Modern Revealed.
So I got to ask, how did you meet Frank Gehry in an elevator?
Frank Gehry in an elevator. What a great question. So there is the world's largest collection of Frank Lloyd Wright buildings for one client right here in Florida. It's in Lakeland, and it's called Florida Southern College.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
10 interconnected buildings. And in 2002, my friend Diane Smart, who used to be the head of the Broward Trust for Historic Preservation.
No relation.
She said, Robin, no. And she said, hey, Robin, have you heard about this Frank Lloyd Wright collection of buildings in Lakeland? I said, no, I've never heard of it before. She says, well, you should go and pay a visit. So I go and pay it a visit. And it's kind of mind-blowing, I mean, it's biophilic design at its very best, but it's got preservation issues. And of course, I've been working on the MIMO project for preservation, so this was like my second big preservation story. So I went up there, and I continued to go up there for the next 10 years or so. But it just so turned out that my timing was about right. And the Guggenheim Museum were going to do a 50-year retrospective of Frank Lloyd Wright, because it had been 50 years since he designed the Guggenheim in 1959, and the show was going to be in 2009. And I learned from a friend of mine that they were going to do this show, and I was a little nervous about calling the curators at the Guggenheim, but I was really pleasantly surprised. And I called up this lady, I remember her name, Maria Ramirez Montague. And I said, Maria, I've got all these photographs of Florida Southern College, and I understand you've got this exhibition coming up. And she says, well, why don't you send them up? And so I sent them up to the Guggenheim. They had a good look at them, and they said, Robin, these are great, but we need you to go back and photograph the buildings with people in them, because this show is called Frank Lloyd Wright From Within Outward, and it has a very strong humanistic element to it. So I went back up there, and I shot the photographs with the people, and they ended up using 11 photographs in the show. And they went to the Guggenheim in New York, and then the same show, the whole thing, went over to Bilbao. But the show at the Guggenheim in New York, I got in the elevator at the top, and I was just about to hit the down button, and this lady, keeps the door open, and it's Frank Lloyd. It's not Frank Lloyd Wright. It's Frank Gehry's assistant.
That would be something.
And then that would be something, right? And she says, "Hold the door open a moment. Hold the door open." And I said, "Okay." And Frank Gehry walks into the elevator, and I'm like, "I can't believe this." Here I am, at the top of the Guggenheim, and Frank Gehry, the other Frank, has just got in the elevator with me. And so it turns out that my business card at the time had the IAC building on it, which he designed in Chelsea there for the famous gentleman. What is his name? Can't remember his name at the moment. But anyway, he had just designed that building, and I had it on my business card. And I said, "You know what? Now's the time to kind of like get my courage up." And I said, "Mr. Gehry." And I said, "You know what? Now's the time to kind of like get my courage up." And I said, "Mr. Gehry, it's really nice to meet you." He didn't say anything. And I said, "Well, do you mind if I give you my business card? It's got your building on it." And he just kind of lifted like one little side of his lip as a little bit of a smile, but he took the card. So by the time I got to the end of the elevator ride, down to the bottom, he had my card. And I said, "Very nice to meet you." And he went off on his way. I said to myself, well, that was an interesting meeting. When I went home after the show, I printed up my 10 very best photographs of the IAC building. And I got this beautiful white envelope, and I got my friend to write the address, Frank's address, in gold leaf calligraphy.
Nice.
So that he would notice it, So then a few weeks later, I get a call from his assistant, and she says, "Oh, Frank saw your pictures of the IAC building, and he'd like to use them in his forthcoming lecture series." So that's how I met Frank.
Wow.
Nice.
That's how I...
Was it
Barry Diller?
Barry Diller was the guy who...
Barry Diller, that's
Yeah.
right. Barry Diller commissioned Frank to do that building, yeah.
If you want to see photos of the IAC building, it's on Google, on Wikipedia, and the address is 555 West 18th Street in New York
Or you
City.
can just ask Robin.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a beautiful building. Very, very, really beautiful building. One of Frank's more restrained designs that works really well where it is.
It was his pre-titanium days.
No, this was after.
Was it after?
The Guggenheim and the Walt Disney Concert Hall? Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Now, Robin, in addition to photography, you have produced two things that I'm a big fan of. One is you have a video series that's on YouTube. Mm-hmm. Where you tell stories about your life and career in photography. And the second is a very well-curated magazine called Frozen Music. Yeah. So would you tell us one of the stories from the video series?
Well, the YouTube video was, it was an idea. And I've been playing around with it for a little while, but there's a couple of good stories that came out of my traveling days. So the day is July 14th, which is Bastille Day, and I'm in French St. Martin in the Caribbean. And I'm shooting photographs for a travel magazine. And on this particular shoot, I have all my 35 millimeter equipment, but I've also got to shoot 2 1/4, which is like the medium format. So I've rented out a Hasselblad, which, as you may know, is a rather expensive camera. So I'm going around Marigot, which is the capital of French St. Martin, and I'm taking pictures there. And there's a very carnivalesque atmosphere because it's Bastille Day, and it's a celebration of the French Revolution. So I'm taking all these really colorful pictures. And eventually I ended up by the harbor wall, and I see these boys jumping into the water about 100 yards away. So I put on my 300 millimeter lens, and I'm taking pictures of these boys jumping into the harbor. And I'm saying to myself in my interior dialogue, oh, this is going to be the front cover of the magazine because the boys are hitting the water and the droplets are hitting the sun. They look like diamonds. And I'm going, oh, this is fantastic. And as I'm having this interior dialogue, somebody comes from behind me and pushes me into the water.
Wow.
And it's quite a long way down. It's about 12 feet or so. And I hit the water. And, of course, I've got all my camera equipment with me.
You got your nice Hasselblad.
Yeah, Hasselblad in tow. Wasn't a good moment. So, luckily, there's a ladder that leads back to the top of the harbor wall. So, here I go. 1, 2, 3. And the bag is really heavy because it's still got the seawater in it, and I'm drowning like a rat. But I get to the top of the harbor wall, and in front of me, there's about 25 youths baying for blood. And it's seriously a dodgy situation, you know. And I scream at the top of my lungs, "What have you done?" And then they all charge me and push me back in again.
Oh, no. What do you say? They were having a lark?
Yeah, it was a lark that was turning very dangerous, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
So you're back in the water.
Expensive.
Yes, and none of my equipment was insured, so this was a major hit. So advice for any photographers out there, please insure your equipment. So I back in the water, and I'm like, I can't believe it, you know. So then I have to start the climb up the ladder again. So it's 1, 2, 3. And as I'm going up the second time, I'm saying to myself, well, my Rambo act, that didn't work. So I got to try something completely different. I said, okay, maybe I'll go with the Gandhi approach. So I get to the top, and they're all laughing, you know. They're having a fantastic time, and I'm totally humiliated. I make myself very small, and I lock eyes on the ringleader. And he's a big guy, you know. He's like 6'2", 200 pounds. And I just walk really slowly towards him. And I don't say anything at all. I just walk slowly towards him, and I never take my eyes off of him. And I look at him in the eye, and then I just walk straight past him, and they let me go. Praise be.
Wow.
So, what happened to the film, you may ask?
Yes.
What happened to the film?
Of course. No film for that day, obviously. But luckily, all the rest of the shoot, the film was back in the hotel. So I didn't lose everything. But I did lose, you know, a good amount of photography equipment. And basically, I had to start all over again on the equipment thing, you know. But the moral of the story is this, is that, number one, you got to be aware of what's happening around you when you're taking photographs. And you can't get too lost in your own interior dialogue, because then you're not being conscious of what's around you. And the other one, of course, is insure your equipment.
Right. So I guess you want to take your eye away from the viewfinder every now and then and look around before you get back to shooting pictures.
Especially if you are in a community situation like that.
Yeah.
You know, obviously if you're out in a landscape and it's just you and the mountains, you know, it's a different kind of thing. But when you're working with people and you're trying to get something that's candid, I mean, there's an ethical quandary there to start with, because who are you to take pictures of people without their permission, you know? But if you don't do that, oftentimes you don't get the most realistic photographs. So you kind of have to ask yourself that question. What I do nowadays, I'm always asking people if they'll have their photograph taken. But once you've crossed that boundary, you lose a lot, because you lose the naturalness of where people are at when they know that they're not being photographed.
Mm-hmm.
So, Robin, do you think that if you had chosen the Gandhi approach first, you wouldn't have been pushed back in the water?
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
I think that they wanted to have their piece of flesh, you know.
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, if the second time I'd have done the Rambo act, I think that I might not be here today, you know.
Yeah.
Well, that may be true.
That's very true.
You know, you have to think of your own safety and you know, what was the best policy there? Because certainly, you know, being violent, I was totally outnumbered. I didn't stand a chance.
If Gandhi turns into Rambo, that's probably not a good move.
Yeah.
But if Rambo turns into Gandhi, that might be, they might want to
that
take a
could
picture of
work.
that, yeah.
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 Check out Sylvester Stallone in his next sequel.
So that I called my late wife up after that, and I said, Cindy, hey, you know, I've really messed up, darling. This is going to take our savings back a long way. And she wasn't very happy about it, but you know, you live and learn. And actually, I used that occasion to change over to Canon from Nikon, because Canon were making a lens that Nikon weren't making at the time, which I use all the time for architecture, which was a tilt shift lens that Nikon didn't make. So, you know, blessing in disguise, and you just got to move on when these things happen and not let it affect you too much, you know. You
can hear this story and others at Robin's series on YouTube. And another great thing that you've been doing, Robin, is a magazine that I think 10 years from now will be a collector's item, because there are only 2 editions of the magazine. And I understand there's probably not going to be a third.
Well, you know, it's a question of value, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the great thing about publishing your own magazine is that you don't have an editor telling you what to do, you know. and you can publish exactly which photographs you want with exactly which text you want to write with it, and nobody else has any say in it. And as an artist, that is a blessing. So I wanted to see what magazines would look like without the influence of an editor or a writer or a creative director or any of that. And what came out of it was, well, the title was Frozen Music, which of course people in architecture know this saying a lot because of what von Goethe said, which is architecture is frozen music, or that, at least that was a very part of what he said. And as a big fan of music and as a big fan of architecture, Frozen Music was a good title for the magazine. But it really allowed me to tell a full story about the architecture that I wanted to talk about without having any outside influence. And that's a very useful exercise. And I'm glad that I did it. Maybe down the road we will do some more. But at the moment, I don't have any plans to do any more.
Well, I know that you have a very special relationship with the Glass House in New Canaan, Connecticut, designed by Philip Johnson. It's really become a passion for you. Are there any plans to do a series on that or a book on that? Because some of your images are really quite remarkable.
Thank you very much. Well, our friend, Michelangelo Sabatino, is just going to be publishing 3 of those photographs in his newest book. And the actual official book to the Glass House has my photograph on the front cover. But I do want to thank Hilary Lewis, who is the chief curator up there. And we've been longtime collaborators for, I would say, 25 years or so. And we've worked on numerous projects together. I believe it's very important for us to preserve the very best of what's gone before, because these 2 houses, the Glass House and Mies van der Rohe's Farnsworth House, they are the apex of high modernism. They deserve to be preserved for future generations so that we can see where we've come from. And if we don't know where we've come from, we don't know where we're going. These 2 particular buildings, they hold, I would say, almost a sacred contract with architects from that period of time that are still trying to teach us something today. I do believe that it's a worthwhile cause, and we should do everything we can to try and preserve them.
Absolutely. You can learn more about Robin and see many of his photographs at robinhill.net. Thanks for joining us.
Anytime, George. Thank you very much, Tom.
Thanks for listening. Want to go with us to Modernism Week in February 2025 and stay with our crew at the U.S. Modernist Compound? Email me at george@usmodernist.org. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by June Goldfinger and Jeff Taylor, sponsors of Circle, Square, Triangle, a traveling exhibition on the architecture of Myron Goldfinger, and by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs. Okay, Mr. Guile, take us out.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 20,500 significant modernist houses, and access 4.3 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song is performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl, with Kelly Policelli on guest research. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guile. George and I'll be back soon with another Looking at the Snow-Capped Mountains Palm Springs edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.